This podcast is sponsored by MediaOcean, the OG of adtech. MediaOcean is a big open market supporter, and that goes both for this pod and the industry. Since 1967, MediaOcean has brought the ecosystem together with an open and interoperable platform that's free from the bias of big tech. And as omnichannel advertising becomes a reality, MediaOcean is bringing AI and automation to bear across the supply chain. For those of you on an entrepreneurial journey, you'll know you've made it when you get your first request to integrate with Prisma. Learn more at MediaOcean.com/pod. And thanks again to MediaOcean for showing open market love.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about founding, building, and growing companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa, and I'm joined by Eric Franchi. What's up, Eric?
Hey, Joe. How's the week?
It's great. So today we want to talk about the idea of a chief audience officer. Eric, what does that mean?
Chief Audience Officer. So I think you invented the term.
Possibly.
Yeah. So this is inspired by an episode of a podcast that both of us really like called By First Million, MFM. And it was a recent episode with one of the co-founders of Tiny. His name is Jeremy Giffen. We'll link it in the show notes. It's actually the first 5 minutes of the episode. Highly recommend you listen to it, irrespective of if you're interested in this concept or not. But basically, the idea is this gentleman who's done some incredible stuff in his career thinks that there's an opportunity to build a business around a creator that already has a large engaged audience. So rather than have them build a business or buy a business, right? Which, creators, are awesome at being creators. Oftentimes they're not the best entrepreneurs or investors. Effectively, his idea is I'm going to buy or build businesses for them, number one. And then number two, rather than, have them monetize through ad reads and all that stuff, although, certainly, great revenue, the equity that they would build and the ultimate monetization of that equity in a business that they own, leveraging their influence, leveraging their audience is going to be way more valuable than any advertising read, they can ever do. And the thesis here is that audiences, loyal audiences of creators are massively underpriced, even long tail, assuming B2B is considered long tail. So, there's some examples of this that have worked out incredible over the course of the past few years. They pointed to in the episode, and I would agree. So Joe Rogan and Onnit, Joe Rogan started working with Onnit years ago, I think, and they were acquired. Onnit was by a CPG, name escapes me, for 9 figures. And the other one that everybody knows is sort of the canonical example of this, Logan Paul with Prime. So the creators of Prime, effectively, had this plan and brought it to Logan Paul and said, hey, be the face of this, be the CAO to speak, and we'll give you a healthy cut of the business. And that's on track to being, I think, something like a $10 billion company. So there's evidence that this thing works.
Yeah, and I think people have an easier time with it maybe in B2C because they think about celebrity endorsements. And you can think about George Clooney and his tequila brand or something like that. I think the dynamic is possibly even more powerful in B2B because you don't need that many customers and you tend to have a deep relationship with the B2B influencer. So for example, you mentioned My First Million, Sean Puri, an entrepreneur and one of the co-hosts of that podcast. He invested in a remote staffing company called Support Shepherd. Now I think they're rebranding it to somewhere.com. And he talked on the pod about how he basically invested and in exchange was I'll be your unofficial chief audience officer or an evangelist for your company. And so he just started mentioning it on the pod, and his audience is business owners. So people who are a fit for the Support Shepherd product. And he said, we expected maybe my audience would increase the company size by, 50, 75%. And it actually increased 300% in the months following the partnership. So I think if you think about this in ad tech, this would be if you were starting an ad tech company and you didn't have a big audience in the space and you wanted to go to Ari Paparo or Matt Barish, someone who has a lot of influence and a big audience in the space. And you said, I'll give you a chunk of this company and you're going to be the chief audience officer. You're going to essentially create a market for this and vastly accelerate deals, which again, I think is very powerful in B2B, because if you're doing 100K a year deals, let's say, and you have a chief audience officer who has, hundreds of people who are really tapped in, you could see how you could have a successful business very quickly on the back of that. And another example of that, to stick with the My First Million guys, the other co-host, Sam Parr, his business Hampton, right? Like he started this essentially entrepreneur networking community. And my understanding is, I don't know if they're at 10 million in revenue yet. I know they probably could be because they're turning away a lot of applicants, but basically they got to several million in revenue super, super fast, in part because Sam was teasing this via his audience. And I think the same thing could apply in adtech.
How do you know that they're turning away people, Joe?
Because they're announcing it, and exclusivity is very hot, Eric. But no, I actually, funnily enough, I get the ads for Hampton and I'm like, this is wasted ad revenue. I'm not quite big enough for this to be relevant to me, but
gotcha. I think you're exactly right. And this might be where the comment about audiences being, kind of massively underpriced, underappreciated goes double for B2B because it's the average order value. Simple as that. So, Logan Paul is moving $4 bottles of Prime. Joe Rogan is moving, it sells a lot of products, but, a lot of them are like, $50 bottles of supplements. Think about the licensing of your average ad tech software platform. Doesn't take a lot to like massively move the needle. But then if you can add a lot, you start, having the foundation of a pretty incredible engine. So this is exciting stuff.
It's worth diving into the idea of the audience being undervalued, because what the Tiny co-founder says is, I think, pretty provocative. He says basically everyone in Y Combinator could find someone like this for their business. And he argues that they could give that chief audience officer 30% of their business and that it would be very worth it for both parties. Because, again, we'll work through those numbers. If you can find someone to get you 50 customers in short order at 100K per year, you're vastly accelerating the business. And then you're also getting capital that you can redeploy and all of that. So I think, that in particular is something to think about, because the way most ad tech companies go about marketing is they basically try to find someone like me, and then, they hire them as a PR consultant or something. And it might be worth thinking about, like, as opposed to trying to do the typical path of like, hiring someone, maybe give them a tiny bit of equity or you pay them 10K per month. Like, what if that person had a stake in the business and were therefore more incentivized to like bring you to their audience and evangelize it? It's a different sort of value equation, but I think something that's underexplored in our industry.
Yeah, I totally agree. I question whether it would be as easy as every Y Combinator company should just find an influencer or an audience officer. I'll try not to use the I word as much as I can. And it might be, why I said the word influencer, right? Joe Rogan, Logan Paul, Kardashians, they're just mass market appeal. Once you start getting into technology companies, which Y Combinator is 100%, your audience or evangelist leader has to be like way deeper in the space that you're building in. So, it makes it difficult. The fact that, all we do is talk about ad tech and, ad tech people and ad tech companies probably makes this way easier for us to dive into. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that unpacking the baggage around influencers is important, because I think that's what a lot of people hear when this type of discussion pops up, and they have a very visceral negative reaction to it because they think influencers is just like, people hawking cosmetics on Instagram. And the way I view it, influence is critical to marketing. And the big difference with marketing nowadays, as opposed to 20 years ago, is you no longer need to build brand equity slowly via gatekeepers you can't directly control. That's the big delta, is that nowadays there are people who have direct audiences and can get you in front of your customer on a daily basis and get you in front of a lot of them and have pre-existing trust. And that's a very different growth curve than, like, again, hiring a PR agency and they're going to pitch reporters and it's going to be very slow and you're not in control of the message. I had a sales conversation today with an ad tech company, and the director of marketing essentially said to me, we spoke 4 months ago, but I think about you at least once a week because I'm constantly seeing your tweets and your newsletter and podcasts and yada, yada. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly it. That's how you cultivate influence nowadays. Like, your customers should be thinking about you at least once a week. And I think that's not the case for the vast majority of ad tech companies.
I've seen it firsthand work. not to jump too far ahead, but we had a fundraise announcement from the portfolio this week. I know we're recording and posting this a week or so later. After I posted it, which I always do, I sort of try to think of myself as not being the CAO for any company, but CAO for lots of companies or junior CAO. There was something about this company in the moment and what they're doing that led to more inbounds than I've ever seen directly to me asking for an intro to that company from prospective customers. And that only happened because I posted it on LinkedIn. Simple as that.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a perfect example of what we're talking about. Okay, so I think if we're going to make the case for the chief audience officer to ad tech companies, we need to talk about something more fundamental, which is what do ad tech customers really care about? I was thinking about this week, not only in the context of this discussion about CAOs, but in the context of the strategic work that I sometimes do for clients, because if I'm like doing a brand redefinition exercise, I'll talk to their customers. So I get the chance to talk to, several dozen ad tech customers, meaning brands, agencies, publishers every year on behalf of my clients. And the biggest thing I tend to find is that, these are tech companies and naturally they believe like the technology and the product are like super important, and they are important. I'm not contesting that. I just think there are other aspects that are equally important to the customer that generally go neglected, and that leads to strategic weaknesses in ad tech companies' approaches to growth. So here are the three things that I've found ad tech customers care about when I ask them, like, oh, well, why do you work with this company and not their competitors? The first
I was going to say, I don't want to be named in an analytics report.
Yeah. And, I mean, you can do that with being super charming and lovely and just being friends with Christoph. So maybe post on LinkedIn and, you won't get burned next time.
Sorry about that. Too easy. Too easy. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So the first is your perception in market. Now, this is related to product. However, what I often find is that I'll have a client and they say like, oh, well, we're doing this now. But the thing they're doing now and that their product team is super excited about is not the thing that their customers think of them for, because they have a reputation in market that might have been defined by someone else, and that might be tied to what they did like 5 years ago. And once you become known for something in ad tech, especially once you get lumped into a category like, oh, you're a DSP or whatever, it's very hard to change that. So number one, perception in market. Number two, relationships. So a lot of the time, like let's say you're working with an SSP and you ask their customers, who do they compete with? They'll quote you 4 random SSPs. And it's like, we all know there are like, 20, 30, 40 SSPs they could be working with. And so you'll be like, okay, why is the consideration set those 4 SSPs? And again, it's a combination of perception or reputation and just arbitrary relationships. Who are the people they happen to work with? And that's a question of like, who shook whose hand at like what event, or who met on LinkedIn or whatever. So it's often like we try to think about things in this very detached, logical way of like, oh, this SSP would likely compete with these other 3 because they're all in native or something like that. And that's often not how it works. And then the third factor, in addition to perception in market and existing relationships, is the people/service. So you're a VC, so you get this. We all want to think we're tech companies and we're not service companies for, financial reasons. But a lot of ad tech companies really do have a very significant service component. And so the other thing you usually hear is they go the extra mile for me. I love my rep. They do custom creative or something like that. And so that's the third thing. And again, all of these things have some relation to the product. Like if you're doing custom creative, your product needs to support that in addition to the people managing the service being able to go that extra mile and like work that customization on behalf of the customer. But all of them are also questions of marketing. They're about perception and relationships, and marketing is how you condition your perception in the market and you create relationships at scale. So as a founder and a VC, What do you think about that? Like, what do ad tech customers really care about? And what is the sort of relation between product and then marketing and sales?
I'm smiling because I'm thinking about the undertone days, because sometimes it's a good frame for me. And if I walk through your framework of perception, relationships, and people, like I take a step back and I think about how hard it was to like move the needle on these things before, frankly, sort of 2024 and with the capabilities we have and the stuff that we're talking about today, and how, like Undertone could have been a different business, if we had access to this stuff. What do I mean? So we started Undertone in 2001 and we eventually were acquired in 2015. So the Undertone of 2001, two guys in an apartment, like sitting next to each other without desks and a printer on the bed. Undertone in 2015 was like 300 people, 12 offices, $100 million plus net revenue. It was a completely different thing. And how many companies were we in the middle of that, right? 2 people to 300, rinky-dink ad network, 1.0 to, whatever sort of, we built at the end around creative. And one of the big challenges that we always had was we had customers that we would be talking to in, call it 2014, that the last time they worked with us or had heard from somebody for whatever reason could have been 2010 or 2007. And they would at times say, you're not a fit for our objectives because you're X. And we're like, wait, no, we're not that at all anymore. This is what we are, right? So this idea of like your perception needs to, constantly reflect what the nature of the business is, and, the sort of kind of strategic objectives that you have is so important. And it's like so much easier today because of the direct channels that we have and the ability to pump out like a lot of content to make sure that, reputationally, the awareness is there. So it was so hard back then, and it should never be, frankly, as hard as it was with the tools that we have in place today. And then the other two, the relationships and people, again, up until fairly recently, marketplace development was like hand-to-hand combat. You needed to be like in the office. You needed to, have face-to-face meetings. Your marketing tended to be oftentimes like trade publications, which were delivered to people's offices or were localized via conferences and events. So if this was a location that you didn't have a presence in, say like, your company is small and you've got a team in New York and you've got a team in LA, and you never go to San Fran, you never go to Atlanta, you never go to Dallas, you never go to Chicago, like you are not known in those markets, and you certainly don't have relationships, and the people don't know you. So again, you fast forward to today with everybody, being terminally online, everybody having a digital presence, and the ability to connect with people, in a normal way online is like accepted. Just all of these barriers are effectively removed. So I think like in addition to the gatekeeper thing, which you mentioned before, the fact that you can do this because everybody lives online today and the ability to, keep everything updated and fresh is there is like incredible. So going back to your question, completely agree. And when customers make decisions, like their minds have already been set. They already know, let's say they know the job to be done, right? Which is sort of a phrase that we like to use at Appearance. They know that they need a DSP. They're going to, start to put DSPs in the consideration set of those who they are aware of. If they've never heard of a DSP, they're not going to make the consideration set. If they've never heard from or seen something, digitally from a person who's a representative or senior person from the DSP, they don't make into the consideration set. So to me, this stuff ties all the way into just how marketing flows through to sales, which is how, ultimately at the end of the day, you win business.
Yeah, I was vigorously nodding. I mean, in terms of conditioning perception, a case study I think of here is Beehive, which is what I use as my newsletter platform. I know Ari uses it as well. And your point about conditioning perception and people knowing what you're actually up to, like in 2007 versus 2014, really resonates with me in that context because like Beehive, I think part of the reason they've been successful, and they just raised, I think, a $33 million Series B, they're around 10 million ARR now. Like the reason they've been successful is like the product is good and they're constantly cranking out new features. And you can tell that like if you've used MailChimp, like MailChimp is like extremely boring and it just feels like something that's owned by a giant enterprise that doesn't give a shit anymore. Like it's just a dumb tool. And like Beehive feels like it's a little like the UI is like a little more complicated, but you can tell that someone's actually trying to make this thing like excellent for its customers and they're trying to help the newsletters on it grow. And part of the reason I know that it's not just because of the product itself. It's because Tyler Denk, the CEO and co-founder, is their chief evangelist. And he's constantly posting on Twitter about all of the features they're releasing. And he does his own newsletter, the whole building in public thing. And that's all to say that like the product is good. And I think that matters. But the impact that the product's value has had on its customers and on its growth is drastically amplified by the marketing he does because he's so loud about the product development they're doing. And then you compare that to like most ad tech companies, like most of us have no idea what the new things they're doing are. Like at some point we learn about them, we categorize them. We're like, oh, that's a DSP or that's a native SSP or whatever. And then we never think about them again. Or we think about them, but only in that context in which we first got to know them. And that's the challenge you're describing. And 15 years ago, that was a really hard problem to solve. But now it's not. Like, I'm not saying it's easy because creating content every day and being charismatic and all that stuff is difficult. But the opportunity to do that is available to you. And then the same thing goes for relationships, to your point. A lot of ad tech companies are living in like 2002. They're just like, we're sales led, we're going to events. So we go to an event once or twice a month or whatever, and we try to meet people. And that's great. You should absolutely do that. But it blows my mind that you have people whose full-time job is to grow the company and build new relationships, and like they have no online presence.
And building audience, being online, engaging, agreed. It is hard work. It's different types of work. But the leverage that you get to theoretically reach, a massive amount of the potential universe of your customers and influencers from a single post is the thing that makes what we're talking about like really, really exciting.
And yeah, sometimes I'll get emails from people who are like, you're saying PR doesn't work, or you're saying like events don't work and like it's not worth it. It's like, no, it's definitely worth it. Like it's still very much a part of how you build companies in this industry. It's just that there's this new stuff too, and you should be taking advantage of every opportunity available to you, especially if you're a little larger, which I think there are a lot of larger companies in our industry with the resources to be pulling all these levers, and they're not.
Victory is getting into the consideration set from a customer. You get into the consideration set from a customer because you're either the leader, you've created a category, or you are by far the winner in an existing category, or you build your reputation to be one of the leaders. And for the majority of folks listening to this, the opportunity is going to be in the latter, which, again, is an achievable goal.
For sure. And regarding like what leads to victory and like what it means or what you have to do to be seen as one of the leaders of the category, like obviously the best way to be seen as the leader of the category is to actually be the leader of the category. That's awesome. Congratulations if you've achieved that. However, what we're talking about is how do you use the marketing and sales tools at your disposal to like manipulate reality and to craft the perception that you're one of the leaders and that you have to be in that consideration set before, honestly, you maybe even have a right to be. And that's what the chief audience officer model and like actively cultivating an audience can do for you. Like perception is reality, right? Like I was talking to Triple F CEO Dave Clark about like, why does marketing matter? And, that's the line he said is perception is reality. And I love to hear that because that's someone who gets it, right? Like every ad tech company should be setting up a system to try to ensure that when their customers are looking for X, they are one of the 4 or 5 companies that have to be in the RFP process. And that's really what we're talking about with cultivating an audience.
Absolutely. So I think we've established that you got to win on perception, relationships, people. How do you do it?
So, first of all, when we say chief audience officer, the extreme version of that idea is having a co-founder who has a significant stake in the business, who is in charge of this, or putting someone in the C-suite who's going to do this, or hiring a chief marketing officer who is sort of adept at like the audience cultivation piece of marketing. I think if you're not quite ready for that, at the very least, you just need to make sure that in your organization, there is someone who is essentially going to embody this persona. And they might not be in the C-suite, right? Like this could be a director of marketing or something. But there should be someone who understands that building an audience is critical to winning, and that actively cultivating that audience is their core job, right? So you don't want to like, I think what frustrates me sometimes is like, I'll talk to a company with like 5 to 10 marketing people and there's like no one working. And that's what I'm sort of trying to challenge here is like, I'm not telling you have to go out and hire a chief audience officer. I am telling you, like, if you have 5 to 10 marketing people or more, and like not a single person is working on this, your priorities are super out of whack and you're missing something that's like absolutely critical. Now, what should that person do? They should be very comfortable articulating the story. They should immediately be able to tell you like 3 points. Why are you different from other companies in the category? What do your customers care about? What are like the 5 topics in the industry you want to own? And what is your POV on those topics? And then they should be prolific. And that's something that I think a lot of companies underestimate the value of when it comes to marketing. Again, because this is in 2002, you should be out there every single day evangelizing your company. If I were hiring someone to market my company, that's the version now of, you know, flying all around the country all the time. Like I would want someone who's going to be like actively building relationships and building awareness every day on Twitter, LinkedIn, and so on. And then, you know, newsletter, podcast, adding channels.
Let me ask you a question, you know, putting on the CEO hat. As a CEO, I have, depending on the stage of the business, 20, 30% ownership, if not more in the business, or co-founders, right? My director of marketing has far less equity in the business. As a CEO, I know I'm in it for the long term. My director of marketing or manager of marketing, they don't have a contract that's tied to the business. So does this question get asked to you by CEOs or by CMOs where it's like Joe Rogan had a multi-year agreement with Onnit and 20, 30% or more of the business. Jake Paul, same thing, right? Multi-year agreement with the company behind Prime, 20, 30% of the business. How do you get a CEO or C-level person comfortable with this idea when the average tenure of an employee in ad tech might be like 12 or 18 months? And is it still a positive for the business? Is it a negative for the business? I feel like this might be one of the objections that I would personally give if it wasn't me being the CAO.
This is a great question. And I think the answer is like something is better than nothing. Like, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, the ideal is absolutely that the CEO or one of the other co-founders, or at least someone in the C-suite, is the chief audience officer, and that someone, you know, someone who's adept at building audiences is supporting them and helping them achieve this, like in terms of strategy, ideation, maybe the actual writing, posting, whatever. But if you can't have someone like that doing this, I mean, I would still rather have a marketing manager or director out there evangelizing the company than no one.
Or even better, the whole marketing team that's all singing from the same script, that, you know, this is part of their KPI. This is part of like what our marketing team does. I think you then have some redundancy in case, you know, your star audience development person, your star evangelist ends up leaving and taking another role.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let me give an example. So I mentioned Beehive. I tweeted a couple weeks ago about the growth of my newsletter since I switched from MailChimp to Beehive. So obviously, I kind of know what I'm doing there, right? Like I'm providing them a case study in real time. And sure enough, I don't even know if I tagged them, but the CEO retweeted it. And like 7 or 8 people from the Beehive team liked it, commented, retweeted it. So that's an example of this isn't just like a CEO going rogue and being like, I'm going to tell my CEO story online. this is a culture of evangelism that my guess is it's not even just the people in marketing and sales there who are participating in that. It's like it pervades the entire company. And that's what I would really want, to your point. Like if I were the CEO of a company with a, 20-person marketing team or a 100-person sales team, I would be like, we are taking over the airwaves. And that's very feasible because most ad tech companies do not do this at all. So it's a low bar to beat.
I love that. And this is what Slack is just built for. Like, a unplanned real-time opportunity to, do some real like creative marketing and evangelism, like put it in the Slack, get everybody sharing it. And like, it's instant, maybe Gen X virality as you might call it, if it's like on LinkedIn or something like that. I love it. It's a good idea.
Exactly. So we talked a bit before about some of the people in our industry who could do this. I mean, I think the obvious suspects are, again, like Matt Barish or Ari Paparo, like people who are out there all the time. I think you had an idea of some other people who might be good at this or could be good at this. Do you want to shower them in glory?
I think, there are people that I think about today that if you were able to attract them to an opportunity like this, they bring such incredible reputation and an active audience that, they make a meaningful difference on day one. Ari obviously is top of mind. I think Lauren from InfoSum, she's incredible. Brian, obviously Scope 3. He's a little bit less frequent and voluminous than he could potentially be. I'll give him some slack. He's got a lot going on and a big job. But like when he drops something, adtech stops and everybody reads it. It's typically like, super impactful and he can move markets. I think there's two camps. So it's there's some people that by reputation alone, having them involved with the business, even, somewhat like Brian, like, if they're not the chief audience officer, but having them connected to the business and doing some targeted evangelism would be incredible, right? So if Jonah Goodhart, wanted to do something, I would snap to it, right? If I had an opportunity to bring Michael Kasson into a business, they just bring such incredible like reputations that have been built over decades. That's very hard to duplicate. There's some folks that, I think about that are just, I think in this sweet spot of great at their current thing. They're doing great at the, audience development, evangelization piece. So number one is Chris Kane. I'm wearing his t-shirt. Feed DSP is what they eat. He dropped that line on our Marketecture pod and he sent me a t-shirt. I think Chris is incredible. He's got this great reputation. He's got super high integrity. People know what he's all about. And if there was an adjacent business, I think, Chris slots in perfectly. I think Jess Sibley, what she's done over the course of the past year or so, taking time to be, from the print magazine that everybody thought about to, super relevant in the digital age. And, she's like posting constantly. I think Jess comes to mind. Dan Pantello. I mean, he is incredible. And he's a really good case study from two perspectives. It's number one, what they do today is not what they did when we first invested in 2019. And he's constantly sort of evangelizing this new direction, which is, again, not relevant for this conversation. I think he's cracked that. But then number two, he's just irreverent. He gets Twitter. He's just like
he's
super
charismatic.
He's super good at
value guy, right?
Yeah. I have that t-shirt too. Michael Sullivan from Sincera. I think Sincera generally, with Mike and Ian, they're getting this with, letting the sort of information lead and, being, I think, extremely directive in what they talk about and not being afraid. The last one I'll throw out, and there's plenty that we can speak to. Antonio Garcia Martinez, AGM, so the guy that wrote Chaos Monkeys. He is, again, sort of terminally online, is well followed. He was on Rogan because he took a trip to Ukraine, and he's actually in the ad tech space. He's doing an ad tech for Web3. So I think those are examples. If you follow those people, you'll get a sense for, I think, what we're thinking about.
To do this, you want to have an optimal balance of talking your book and just like being entertaining and doing thought leadership. I think the people who are best at this do a combination of all three of those things. I think there are some people who obviously, like, the classic CEO problem with marketing is like they think LinkedIn is just a place to talk about their own business super directly. And like no one likes that. And it's like only their team who will interact with it and whatever. But then I also think actually there are some people who go the other direction, and sometimes it's enforced by their company where they don't say anything about their business. And I'm like, that's also a missed opportunity because, like, if you're a leader in this industry, I want to know, like, not just shilling for your business, like, yeah, have 10% of the post be shilling for the business, but I also just want to know about your business. Like, I want to understand, like, what makes a great SSP nowadays? Like, what are the best practices? What are the problems and how are you solving them? Like, what are some interesting customer stories? And you don't need to name the customer, but just like educate me about the category. I think the ideal chief audience officer is doing all three of those things. And I think some of the people you mentioned fit the bill.
What if someone works at a public company and they actually have restrictions around communication?
Yeah, I think in that case, I mean, obviously you need to comply with the rules or whatever, right? But the ideal would be that you understand that this is a priority and you're working with legal or whomever to figure out like what are the bounds. Because surely, I mean, especially in among consumer facing companies, there are tons of super provocative like public companies, right, who have like crazy Gen Z social media managers. So it's definitely not the case that like public companies can't say anything online. I think they just need to be a little more systematic about it. And by the way, if that's not you, and for the vast majority of ad tech companies, they're not in that category, they are privately owned, take advantage of it. Be a little controversial, be a little loose, be entertaining, because that's a huge advantage. And if you are not public, you don't need to worry as much about that scrutiny.
One more question. Let's say you are the private company, the private ad tech company CEO, and you feel stuck. You haven't tweeted since 2016. Your last tweet was actually not you. You got hacked. Maybe you can get your password back. You post company press releases on LinkedIn. Where do you even start? And I know this is a topic for an entire different podcast, and we should do that podcast. But if somebody's like, okay, all right, I'm buying it, Joe, Eric, I'll do this. What are maybe the first couple of steps that he or she can take?
Yeah, great question. I have two immediate actionable tips. One is to create a list of 10 to 20 people in the industry who are posting consistently and who have interesting things to say, and just start commenting on their stuff. Because that's how you're going to build an audience or re-enliven an audience anyway, is it's not going to be from scratch. It's going to be engaging with other people, and then they're going to come listen to what you have to say. Like I do a thing with my clients where we come up with what I call house topics and POVs. It's just like working with whoever's going to be the evangelist to figure out what are like 5 topics we want to own in the market, right? So it might be like attention or privacy or whatever. And then what is our perspective on that? And when I say what is the perspective, I mean, we might write a couple paragraphs where we say, okay, well, here's kind of the issue and here's what we think about it. Just so that if you're ever stuck and at a loss for inspiration, you can look at that doc, which should be very simple, 1 page, 2 pages, and you can say, what am I going to write about? One of these 5 things. What do I think about it? Here's what I think about it. And then you can just sort of iterate on that and maybe like write about it in the context of the news or something.
It's like anybody could do it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. So you have no reason now not to be your own chief audience officer to go out and find one.
We want to see tweets, people.
Join us on Twitter. It's getting lit.
Amazing. Right. Thanks, Joe. This is a great conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric.
Bye-bye, everybody.